Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CPC Virtual I-Day. Thank you all for attending. I'm Sue Quimby. I'm a past president of the New Jersey chapter. This is our first time hosting a virtual I-Day, and so far the presentations have been excellent. The session is being recorded, so everyone will be on mute. If you have questions, you can type them into the chat, or you can raise your hand to be acknowledged. Please post your responses and your reactions to our I-Day using hashtag NJIDay20. I'd like to introduce our presenter today. His name is Patrick Kelahan. He serves as a building consultant for H2M Architects and Engineering, a Long Island, New York firm recognized as a regional expert in public sector, commercial firematics, and forensic engineering. Very interesting stuff. In this role, Patrick serves as an insurance carrier subject matter expert for the firm, advising and interacting with staff and ensuring carrier needs are met. Additionally, Patrick is charged with observing and anticipating what comes next in the insurance carrier world. As a passionate follower of the global insurance innovation initiatives, Pat interacts with the industry as the insurance elephant. He has initiated discussion and articles focusing on the Tences Project that is posing parametric options for pandemics and other systemic risks. Today's presentation, the Tences Systemic Risk and Economic Response to SME Business Interruption, Planning for the Next Pandemic, which will be very interesting given the topic we had last time, talking about what happened with this pandemic. So, Patrick, take it away.
Thanks, Sue. That's boy, I don't know who that guy is that you introduced, but I'll do my best to live up to it. Before I dive in, I certainly would like to thank the New Jersey CPCU chapter for inviting me to participate. I very much appreciate it. And the sessions, the agenda, wonderful stuff. And a tip of the hat to Pat Stokes for encouraging me to participate and then being, let's say, persistent in making sure I stuck to my guns and got the presentation done. And certainly, Sue, thank you for being the moderator. And I think you're going to sneak in a couple of poll questions if that's possible. But and also the other presenters, I'm hoping I live up to what they've already done ahead of me and what they will be doing after my session. But let's jump right in. Now I changed the topic a little bit because the Tences Project, while it's viable, it's really systemic risk. How do I get rid of this little thing? There we go. Insurance and economic response to SME business interruption and planning for the next pandemic. And prior discussions have certainly indicated how terrible the effect has been on small and medium enterprises due to the pandemic. So how does the insurance world and business sectors respond and plan for the next time? Today's session's goals, brief discussion of BiCover, factors that made BiCover not being in effect for COVID-19. I'm not going to focus too much on those because they were touched on in prior sessions. Can we plan for the next black swan or systemic risk event? And then options that might be in the marketplace that are multifaceted, including the Tences Project type of approach. And certainly answering questions that may be posed. I might push the question session to the very end so that we don't lose track. That being so that I don't lose track of what I'm doing. So thanks, we'll dive right in. Sue already covered this. I work for an architecture and engineering company, but I've been 20 plus years working for a large homeowners carrier prior to my work there. So I've got a lot of experience dealing with this. I'm a customer service nut, so the BI piece is important. At the very bottom of this are my Twitter handles and LinkedIn. And anyone who needs a copy of this session, God forbid, just drop me an email and I'll send it out to you. About H2M, just real quick, we're the cause and origin, mold, asbestos, folks that carriers call when they need that to help service claim customers. Again, H2M, easy to remember. If for some reason you need something like that or just want to talk about technical issues, give me a buzz. Okay. Business interruption cover, and again, apologies if this was already touched on. Business interruption coverage, orphan child of commercial insurance. And it's been, boy, didn't this COVID-19 bring that up as a real problem where direct physical loss wasn't there and this huge gap in coverage was there. It's just something people don't think about that much. What does it mean? What typically drives cover for business interruption, and how are BI claims generally investigated? We'll touch on those very briefly before we get into the meat of the discussion. Orphan child, most businesses hardly think of business interruption coverage. They think of, all right, I've got to have this for my my loans or my agreements with contracts, but they don't think about that business interruption that might come if they have a covered peril. It's difficult to visualize it. Any of you who work on personal lines claims, when someone has something bad happen to their house, they don't even think about those additional costs. It's like ALE, except for the commercial business. People don't think about it. It's difficult to quantify. It's not like saying you've got 100 square feet of production space, or 35 tables in your restaurant. It's just vague financial thing. And it's a pain in the butt for the carriers to adjust. Yet it is the critical, I don't want to say it is a critical part, it is the critical part for insurance recovery path. It's what keeps their business in continuity. And then for the coronavirus, COVID-19, the SME BI losses are estimated at more than 1 trillion in the US alone. And I would suggest probably closer to 2 or 3 trillion. Harvard Business School just estimated that the GDP loss alone for business in the US is 8 trillion. So since so much of our business in the US is SME driven, it's a couple of trillion. So that's why we're discussing that today. What typically drives cover in the policy, and this has come up in a lot of the court cases, direct physical loss or damage to property. That's the tough part. So how are we planning for a business interruption for something that's not a direct physical loss? Suspension of operations caused by direct physical loss. Does that mean you can't bring people into your business? Do you have to do some other way? I mean, it's really, as the legal cases show. Pays only for loss of business income caused by direct physical loss. And exclusions, there of course are exclusions in most policies caused by virus or bacteria. And here's a real crux for the millions of businesses in the US. What is business interruption coverage? It's important for how we would plan for the next one. Is it loss of business income, net income? Is it additional incurred expenses? Is it loss of gross income and net or net? Is it reduction of cash flow? Is it, what loss periods are involved in? And certainly, again, as the litigation is showing and how expectations are, if you look at policies, they're all written a little different. In the UK recently, the Financial Conduct Authority had some sample court cases where they were testing the waters on this. And Hiscox, in that session in the UK, had 700 policy forms in force. 700. How is it that the industry can plan around that? And I'm sure every carrier is different that way. It's a bespoke cover. So keep that in mind. Is that something that has to be addressed as well as we go along? How are the claims generally investigated and adjusted? Well, you get the loss, an adjuster says, well, I don't, send me your records, your financial records. Well, does that mean tax returns? Does that mean balance sheets, profit and loss? Does that, what does it really mean? And then you have to start to compare the past results with the post-loss results. And then the businesses say, well, looking forward, here's what I expect is going to be a problem. Are there continued or added expenses that are involved? This is, you virtually raise your hand, but don't say anything. If you've adjusted business interruption losses, reach around with your arm and pat yourself on the back, because they are, they're troublesome to deal with and frustrating for the customer, frustrating for the adjusting staff. And it develops into email ping pong, which is, of course, frustrating for all. And of course, you'll have multiple cases going at once. So how do you deal with them promptly? Here's an example. This is real world, by the way. typical output of a business interruption claim adjustment. You've got this spreadsheet, and this is one of 4 spreadsheets on a loss I looked at. I wasn't adjusting it, but I was interacting with it. All of this information that has to be provided for one business interruption claim. So think of the COVID-19 or any future pandemic or any future systemic loss. In the current indemnity coverage world, carriers say, here's what we need. And it's fair because the business interruption is going to reimburse an insured for what has been lost. So you've got to prove what was lost. But it gets to the crazy point of all of these data that are entered. And if you look at that number I have circled at the bottom of that page, all of this work to prove a $7,541.54 business interruption claim. It involved a staff adjuster, it involved a business interruption CPA adjuster, and a whole bunch of things going on. And it's not that it's the wrong approach, but it's the approach the industry has built over time. Multiple emails, it's a numbers chase, reinforcement of the misconception that business interruption cover is. If we're planning to the future where there's the possibility of having coverage overall for business interruption due to a systemic risk, can the industry afford to spend this much time in building a indemnity settlement of $7,541? It becomes a false economy, doesn't it? But we have to be fair and uniform in the insurance world. Each claim has to be handled on its own merit based on the indemnity principle. And this is what develops out of it. That sad face down in the lower left is the best I could do to voice my opinion on it. It's a $1 trillion problem for the insurance industry, its customers, and the entire US economy. And it's so unknown that the frustration has burst into litigation for insureds looking to get business interruption coverage after they've been denied coverage. So current litigation is about 1,250 cases in the US. So you know that the denials of coverage far exceed that. The 1,250 cases are those who are either really motivated and in desperate straits, or driven perhaps by the plaintiff's bar or whatever. But 1,250 cases probably equates into a factor of 1,000 or more denials for this thing. So I guess my point is it's a real problem that the industry can't walk away from, because coverage gaps, and I don't want this to sound hard, coverage gaps are a failure of the risk management world to find a solution for something. And nobody says that a systemic risk should be a covered item in the current indemnity world. Take flood. Flood's not always covered, or take other types of systemic risks. But it suggests something. It's such an important part of our economy, as we've all experienced from the coronavirus COVID-19 effects, that if there's not a resilience or there's not a backstop for it, and if 1 out of 5 small businesses go out of business, that equates into employment, that equates into loss of business for everybody on this call who works with an insurance company. It's important that something transpire, that we come up with some type of a solution. I don't say a solution, some type of mitigating positive effect that we can get into this. And that's the point of our discussion today. Now, for all the underwriters and actuaries and everybody else on this, that bullet point, first one, pandemic is not a diversified loss. Typically in underwriting, you're not going to get 100% of the insured population in an area suffering the loss. And that's what happened with the shutdown and pandemic, the effects of coronavirus and COVID-19 management by government. They closed everybody down. All right, so everybody who's insured becomes in the pool of potential indemnified persons or businesses. And the law of large numbers doesn't apply then. You know, you can't diversify the risk across the entire insured population. But you know what? You could insure business interruption coverage. You could set the limit for everybody at $1 and charge them $1.40 to cover expense and a couple of points for profit, but that's impractical. You just can't do it. Now, looking back to SARS outbreak in 2006, that was primarily in the Far East, but insurance companies got savvy to it right away. It's like, holy cow, we can't have viral outbreaks and bacterial outbreaks as part of our coverage. It would bankrupt the industry. So that became the source of the exclusions for viruses and bacteria. And certainly that third bullet point, financial resources not being present in the industry to afford business interruption coverage for pandemics, it just can't be more stark. I read just today before this session, there was a survey done amongst potential jurors across the country about, you know, how should court see or outcomes of court cases where there's pandemic and there should be, you know, what's up with business interruption coverage. And for the most part, let's say higher than 50% of the people said, oh yes, absolutely, insurance policy should cover it, even if it's not stated in the policy. So the insurance world has a problem with communication, doesn't it? Where if the rank and file public or business people think, well, why shouldn't it be covered? It's a business interruption. Well, and I'll touch on this in a slide later on. Even if there were 5 million business interruption claims for the pandemic, and they averaged 100,000 each, which easily could be the case since it's going on 7 or 8 months, that's $500 billion. And just adjusting those claims 8 hours per claim, you know, that's 40 million hours times 100, you know, we're talking another 5 or 6 billion just in expenses, and sucking up 2 months of time for insurance companies to adjust the claims under an indemnity system. It's a terrible challenge, but it's so important to our economy to do it. And that's why we're having the discussion. And truly, the fourth bullet point, no one believed a pandemic of such proportions as COVID-19 could occur. Who'd to think of such a thing? Well, I certainly didn't. Can the industry and business sectors at large plan for the next black swan or systemic risk pandemic? If you look at what happened in the US economy after the shutdowns due to COVID-19 outbreaks and such, you know, the response to businesses, paycheck protection program loans, direct assistance to economic sectors, whether it be the hotels, the airlines, whatever, payments to taxpayers, a couple of trillion already, and they're working on more. But it took months, and it was politically driven. It's slow, it's expensive, it's all borrowed. It's inequitable. In the time it took between the outbreak and the distribution of funds, there were sectors that had partially or in full collapsed because the risk management world couldn't deal with it as based on what we saw. And the backup plan, as is with all disasters, and I'm speaking US, is the federal government. And the federal government works deliberately and works in a political fashion. And of course, we all know this is an election year. So the political wranglings had that extra piece. So even the early responses have been exhausted, and now we're experiencing what's the next step to keep businesses afloat. And insurance companies paying rebates on premiums, insurance companies not getting renewals and retention of customers. There's going to be a long-standing effect. You know, we all hear about incurred but not reported claims. Well, we're having incurred but not paid renewals that haven't been necessarily factored in. the biggest crazy piece is it was not anticipated so much that there wasn't the reinsurance backing for pandemics, so that there wasn't even that backstop. Munich Re and Marsh had a plan that they introduced last fall. Nobody bought it because who would anticipate such a thing's coming up? And that last line, because insurance is counted on to be the backstop for business, but it couldn't be. The optics for the insurance world were and continue to be pretty rough. So, we got a poll.
I've launched the poll.
Nice. I'll give everybody a second to answer that poll question. If you get, there's two questions. If you get both of them right, I tip my hat, but there's no prize or other recognition other than self-satisfaction. And I just answered mine, but I knew what the answer was.
You don't get extra credit for that.
No extra credit. That's exactly correct, Sue. I'll wait couple more seconds. Okay. So there will be another pandemic or cyber event or climate change. Some other type of systemic risk is going to come up. There's a recognition that non-diversified risks are impossible for the insurance world to write as indemnity cover. But we have to recognize that small SMEs are the country's economic engine. Employment, opportunity, market builders, the lead on all of those by far. SMEs provide 90+% of all the employment in the country. It's so critical. They are also, though, well, let's see. Oh, look at that. There's the results. The most appropriate answer, I don't want to say the correct answer, most appropriate answer, in my opinion, was all of the above. So good for all of you for hitting that. And I'm not saying the other answers were incorrect because they were all valid. Okay, so SMEs are the most fragile in terms of economic resilience. It's not like they have a year's worth of cash sitting in the bank. Most SMEs work hand to mouth financially. They're also the least sophisticated in financial record keeping. There's a lot of reasons why SMEs are great, but they're not the people that you're not going to hire them necessarily because they're CPAs acting with an apron on in the restaurant. And the insurance industry cannot plan to provide indemnity BI cover. I don't care what plan you have. Well, wait, I take that back. You could write $100,000 BI cover and charge somebody $25,000 a year for it, and nobody will buy it because it's just too, well, for a lot of reasons, it's not going to work out. The numbers still don't work, no matter how you look at it. And certainly after this, the shutdowns and the rollouts, Lloyd's of London and Chubb and Swiss Re and Munich Re, all the big players said, look, it's just not going to work. It can't be done. And I don't disagree with them. And every insurance company represented on this conference knows, when they sit around in the financial planning area and the actuaries, everybody knows that indemnity BI cover cannot be written. Oh, my button's not buttoning. There we go. How to plan? This is my humble opinion. Effective and affordable post-occurrence responses and planning for future events can only be planned holistically, meaning multiple avenues and multiple important players. All right, that's all cute and fluffy language. But what does it really mean? It means that all of these participants are affected and have to be participants in what a solution might be. The SMEs, of course, because they're the beneficiaries of it. Carriers have to be a part of it because the carriers are populated with lots of really smart people who understand losses, understand adjusting, understand customer service, have the expertise to communicate it to customers. And I'm not just talking carriers, I'm talking agents and so on. But certainly the product development, distribution, claim adjusting folks, they're the heart of it. They're the ones that make it work. Regulators are getting the picture now that things have to change. And since the US has got 57 different regulatory agencies, getting them all on the same page will be difficult, but it's got to happen. There's just no other choices. Of course, the federal government has to be part of it because they'll be the backstop to anything that happens. But each time a systemic risk occurs, there will be a little different political landscape. So whatever the plans are, it's got to be able to mitigate those effects for politics, at least a little bit. But the federal government's the one that could print the money. Capital markets have been underrepresented up till now. And I'm suggesting that capital markets can become a much bigger participating group for risk financing, because the capital markets hold hundreds of trillions of dollars in their coffers, as opposed to insurance companies that might have 600 or 700 billion. So capital markets can be a big part of it. Industry organizations, they understand best how their particular industries work, and they can present industry pro formas up front to help alternate risk financing understand what's going to happen. Now, this was the piece when Pat Stokes first started talking to me back in March, after the shutdown was hitting, the pandemic was really hitting. I wrote a white paper and created this little project called the Tences Project. I just kind of threw it together. And I'm not that smart of a person, but I knew through experience and through dealing with customers forever that something had to give, and we had to have people involved in it. So 10 C's just came up because I came up with 10 bullet points that started with the letter C. All right, the concept, of course, was the holistic piece. The cover was, you know, what would be in place to help mitigate the economic effect? Is it indemnity or is it parametric? Capacity, it's got to be more than just what the insurance world brings in. There's got to be a loss capacity that touches on capital markets as well. Catastrophe, of course, by definition, whether it's a black swan catastrophe, could even be cyber or some other type of catastrophe that affects even intangible assets. Captives can be a big part of this. You know, there can be pooled captives that can start planning for the next pandemic right now. And there are, I know of many, where small groups of similar companies are building pooled captives. If we can get past the IRS being so suspicious of it, it's a great avenue that can be part of this. Collaboration amongst all the players, I don't have to explain. Continuity, what I mean by that is it's got to get past political, well, let's say it's got to get past the 2-year congressperson election cycle. It's got to be able to carry past a 4-year presidential election cycle. It's got to be a way to keep the collection of funds coming in. There's got to be plenty of capital behind it. And the collection, I'm sorry, that would be a way for the insureds to collect, and then contribution would be from many parts. So that's just the general framework. If you want to know more, the www.tensesproject.com is in there. Right now, the concept has been pivoted a little bit. It's part of the Lloyd's Lab innovation session, cohort 5 right now, with my colleague, Dr. Marcus Schmalbach, representing that in a project through Lloyd's in London. How to plan for BiCover. There's some early program suggestions that are out there, immediately came out, and it's great to have the discussion. Some of you may be aware of them. The PRIA, Pandemic Risk Insurance Act, modeled on the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act. Government as a backstop. The challenge with that is it's still an indemnity plan. It's got a ceiling that insurance carriers need to reach as a deductible almost, and then the federal government becomes backstop up to, I think, 350 billion. But no matter what, you still have to adjust all those claims. That's still a big part of this. And I'm not sure the expense part of that is going to be part of it, but just the admin overburden makes that a difficult thing. The BCPP, or the Business Continuity Protection Program, championed by National Association of Mutual Insurance Companies, APCIA, IIA. It's a different program. It's a great initiative in many aspects, but it has its challenges as well. It's where the insured chooses a threshold amount. There's a verification of the prospective insured's books. There's an ongoing contribution made. It's administered by FEMA, and it is a modified parametric plan. But again, there's still a big administrative part of it. Getting the approval through FEMA applications, excuse me, and then getting the payment confirmed. What's the trigger? What's the index on that? So both great thoughts, but still huge undertaking administratively, and it's not addressing that. We need the immediate money in the street aspect. Another quotation, and I'm raising my hand: indemnity insurance model is inadequate for systemic risk planning and use. It's just too cumbersome, primarily due to indemnity severity being difficult to estimate, okay, for business interruption, and the claim-related delays in getting response funding to the street. It's, again, anyone on this conference who's wrestled these claims understand how enormously burdensome they are. And it's not like you can have CAT adjusters come in and do it. It takes experienced people to take care of that. So it's something that's got to get passed. Getting business interruption response funding to the streets is key. Waiting for indemnity claim handling for a few million claims overwhelmed. Having worked in the federal government disaster program for a while, the importance of FEMA grants getting out to neighborhoods, regions, geographies to help people start cleaning up, doing things is critical, even before an SBA disaster loan might be gotten. And the piece that's not spoken of, but is really important, is the emotional relief that businesses and residents feel when they get a little bit of funding so that they can move forward with something. It's putting a little light at the end of the tunnel. And the same thing needs to be part of what we do in pandemic responses going forward. And if any of you who are economic majors, if you think back, the velocity of money principle, that means if you put $100 out in the street and the butcher spends it at the grocers and then the ice cream store and then the hair cutter guy, you take $100 and it becomes more than $100 because it keeps getting passed around. Prior to the onset of the shutdown, the velocity of money factor for the US was about 1.4. And I don't want to belabor that, but basically what it says is if 250 billion gets to the street, it can have an economic effect of 350 billion. All right, think about that. But if you think backwards, if we don't have the money on the street, 250 billion also has a negative effect of not providing 350 billion worth of gross domestic product. It's important. Get the money to the street. It changes people's thinking, attitude, etc. It gets the economies going, gets the emotions going. Checking my time.
Here's your next poll.
Ooh, the next poll, excellent. I like this one. I'm going to answer mine.
I vote for the second one.
Sock of money. Legislate pandemics out. I like the sock of money.
Yeah, that's the other good one.
I'm going to answer sock of money. Okay.
I can't answer, so.
Yeah. All right, and that was kind of a fun one, but it's a serious topic, but a fun question. So how can we get funds distributed promptly in a pandemic response? Well, if you move from an indemnity model to a parametric model, and parametrics essentially is you identify something as a risk, you identify an amount of money, and you identify, well, what's the trigger of that? So if we look at, instead of someone proving a loss and then getting indemnified, it's, all right, we're going to agree if this happens and it's a certain amount, look at that, 5%, that must have been me for the sock. That's funny. Parametric response takes all that indemnity overburden out of it. For a pandemic, yes, if there's a shutdown, if the governor declares it, and it's for a certain amount of time, the whatever program, whether it's an insurance or some other program, is going to pay the participants some amount of money. There's no fiddling around, all right? It simply happens, all right? And record keeping can be through blockchain or distributed ledger. Take it out of the hands of all the individual insurance companies. And I'm not saying don't take the control out of it, but make it simple. Make it a quick distribution. Parametric response. You have an amount, something triggers it, and there's a quantifying amount of trigger that says, here's what's going to happen. For example, it might be, okay, we've got the next pandemic. The governor of New Jersey says everybody's got to close down for 4 weeks. In the policy or the program, it says, oh, for a 4-week shutdown, the governor's done it. There's going to be a distribution based on an agreed amount for each policy holder or each program holder. A large company might have a proven need for 100,000, but Sam's barbershop or Mary's hair salon might need 20. And it immediately goes out. It's clear. It's immutable record keeping. It's simpler than having 40 million man hours figuring out what the indemnity is. Sorry, my down arrow button. I have to talk to the tech guy. So easy to say that. I mean, man, Pat's not the smartest guy. I mean, some of the other people, easy to say, how do you do it? Build the fund. All right, it's to everybody's advantage to be prepared ahead of time instead of trying to backfill through the treasury afterwards. What's wrong with having tax advantage premiums or self-contributions? What's wrong with pricing per expectation of a pandemic's frequency, which, you know, the World Health Organization says, well, pandemics 7 to 8 years. All right, it might be SARS, it might be Ebola, it might be whatever. Plan for it. Use the actuaries and underwriters. Government recognition that upfront fund building is less costly than ex post facto bailouts. That's a tough one. It's hard to persuade people to plan ahead than it is to say afterwards, let's just print money out and give it to people. Okay, that's a tough one, getting everybody involved. Insurance company administration. Who's better at information and money than an insurance company, the insurance industries? And once this program's set up, set it in record keeping that's transparent to everybody, but easy to administer. Push a button, payment methods come out. It sounds, I just make it sound easy, but it's a uniform approach now. Planning ahead is better than trying to backfill with what we've got. Here's an example, the pandemic, a black swan event. A black swan event essentially is an event that can't be planned for in its extent, its breadth and depth. Otherwise, it would be insurable, right? So something comes up that's unplanned for. You determine the trigger. What's going to make the plan go into effect at fund inception? The index is determined at fund inception. What's the amount? What's the extent of what the trigger is that's going to make this have to go? It's not a full solution. Encourage tax advantage self-savings. What's wrong with setting up a fund, almost like a disaster business 401k, where people contribute? Now, most businesses can't plan ahead for that because they're living hand to mouth. But if it's tax advantaged and there's a little bit of a administrative coercive squeeze on it, and it's planning for the entire economy to help out, I think it's workable. And then certainly encourage captives for systemic risk and BI cover. Right now, the IRS is overbearing on captives that are put together, micro captives particularly, because up till now, the people who use the business is using captives. I don't want to say most, but there's a fair number of captives that are created simply to be tax dodges. But make the program simpler, make it useful and responsive, encourage upfront planning for potential systemic risk, put tax advantages not only for contributions, but for distributions, allow people to borrow against it, do all these cool things that make it useful. Make it useful for businesses to save in advance of things happening. Because what's the alternative? 40 million businesses that were closed up, a couple $1 trillion worth of SME business interruption losses, millions, I think the highest number was like 24 million people that lost their jobs because of it. It just speaks volumes that we have to plan better. And the insurance world can be a big part of it. All right, well, we're close to our end point, right, Sue? Today, we touched on business interruption coverage. We recognize factors not being in effect for most COVID-19 shutdown claim. I'm the optimistic guy saying we can plan for the next black swan or systemic risk event. And we talked about some of the options in the marketplace. I don't know if any questions came in, Sue. We got a few minutes left to touch on those, but.
I had a couple comments. Wendy says she's a fan of pandemic preparedness. She remembers one point Lloyd's just paid out on cargo. And eventually they invested a lot in being able to recover from shipwrecks, etc. Mm-hmm. So there's no way of knowing if it's going to next pandemic will behave the way this one did. So there's a lot of new technology going on. And Denny says, well, it needs to depoliticize the exposure, which is obviously true. Backstop is our best bet. Keep the proactive stuff going. James mentioned that the health factors are different, and being able to deal with it and focus on the people that are more impacted and reducing the severity might help if that could be done. I think that was.
Yeah, those are great comments. And talking on that last one, the beauty of a parametric cover is that up at the inception of the plan, any business can establish its own unique response, not only limit, but what the triggers are. And yeah, initially it'll be a little complicated, but that's where the hard work happens, is at policy inception, as opposed to trying to figure it out afterwards. So part of the planning isn't only financial, it's administrative, and it's people understanding what's my business now, what would happen if I had an interruption, which we don't really do right now. We don't think about that ahead of time. So my closing note will be, for anyone on this conference session who deals with selling or administering business policies, consider educating people on, here's part of your policy that's going to be really important. God forbid you have something that happens. Think about the drivers of the coverage, whether it's net income, gross income, cash flow. What does that mean to you now? And have an understanding of would be available to you after a loss, even in the indemnity world. And then all of us have to work on some other kind of solution, because look at what we're doing. We're having a virtual conference because of this pandemic. It's a crazy effect. And I think I've got 2 minutes short of the call. So anybody have a joke? Sue, you can sing if you want. But I really appreciate everybody who's on, presuming you paid attention, you weren't multitasking. But I'm passionate about this. If anybody wants to have a discussion or a copy of these notes, I'll be happy to share them. Just drop a note out through, and the NJCPCU has a copy of this. I'll be happy to, I'll talk about this at length with anybody for any length of time.
Well, thank you, Patrick. On behalf of the New Jersey and Central Jersey chapters, we want to thank you for this excellent presentation, obviously very timely. They will be sending you a gift card as a thank you. So,
well, that's nice.
Spend it wisely. And hopefully everyone has enjoyed this presentation. We have a couple more coming up at 3:20. Carrier innovation and the future of insurance are your choices. So hopefully you'll be able to join one of those as well. So unless there's any other questions, thank you, everybody, and Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
Patrick.
Thanks, Sue. Great work.